Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Today I'll be taking a look back on the meta for all of Set 5. There's a lot of mechanics introduced in Set 5 ranging from Shadow items and Reckoning to the Radiant items from Dawn of Heroes. We'll look at how impactful those mechanics were alongside of compositions, traits, and a general overview of how the game played out in each stage. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, let's take a look back at all of the system mechanics throughout Set 5. The initial mechanic introduced was, of course, Shadow items. Shadow items were unfortunately not all that successful. The reason for that is split between the casual player base and the competitive. For new and casual players, Shadow items were just too overwhelming because of how many there were. There was a lot of info, and knowing the best Shadow item for every situation just made the game tedious and less fun. On the other side of the coin, competitive players disliked how Shadow items were either clearly too strong or too weak compared to their regular versions. This is an issue because Shadow components were only available through the Armory and Carousel. If you didn't get what you needed, well, tough luck, while other players got exactly what they needed. Despite the attempt to give player agency, it actually reduced it. That said, the best part of Reckoning was the introduction of the Armory. Armories did give player agency because now you had a more definitive way of building items. Of course, this was marred by Shadow items, but still, Armories were an overall good thing for the game. With that, we can move into Dawn of Heroes, where Shadow items left and Radiant items were added. While there were a lot of Radiant items, they reduced the amount of choice a player had to make by limiting players to one Radiant item per game. Well, until later on when the second Radiant Armory was added. But the point is, this took what worked best with the Armory, which is giving players agency. It also helped for casual players, as making one decision on 3-6 between 5 items was a lot easier than figuring out what Shadow items were worth making. And the final two mechanics of Set 5, both introduced in the mid-set, are the Divine Blessing and Tome of Traits. Blessing, also known as Stimmy, provides a means for players to have a potential comeback. The idea behind the blessing is great in one of the rare instances where they lowered the variance in the game because everyone got the same value in their blessing. Tome of Traits made it possible for players to gain emblems they otherwise couldn't or were unable to find a spatula. Overall, it was a successful mechanic because it opened up a lot of diverse compositions in the game and once again gave players a bit of agency in their decision making. All in all, the mechanics of Set 5 were rough around the edges. A few good ideas like Armory, but also a few not so great ideas like Shadow items. Now let's shift over to the meta by talking about the overall meta throughout Set 5. There's 3 aspects to the Set 5 meta to look at: vertical traits, utility legendary champions, and reroll comps. We all remember how much of an issue vertical traits were in Reckoning, with the main 3 being Forgotten, Dawnbringer, and Redeemed. Skirmisher was also an issue, but more so in the mid-game around Stage 3. The issue with vertical traits was how easy it made putting together comps. Slap in 6 in one trait and boom, you've got a strong composition. It made flexible play less viable since a player could decide in Stage 2 if they wanted to go a certain build. Thankfully, in Dawn of Heroes, the series of balance changes and the removal of some champions reduced how prominent vertical traits were in the meta. That said, it was still an issue as Sentinels were always a top composition throughout the mid-set. Vertical traits were also the flavor of the set because 5-cost champions were more about supporting than carrying. Kindred? Mystic with a support ability. Garen, Darius, and Volibear were all frontliners. Teemo could carry, but was generally used for his attack speed slow, plus it was difficult to 2-star him because he cost health. Diego could certainly win rounds, but not as a carry. The only true carry was Heimerdinger, which led to metas where a capped level 9 board revolved around him, Volibear, and Ivern. Once the mid-set came out, they introduced Akshan, a viable late-game AD carry, and Gwen, a pseudo-AP carry. The introduction of those two champions did help reduce the stagnant vertical meta, but the issue of there not being a consistent late-game carry was still present. And finally, reroll comps. There were a lot of truly dominant reroll compositions throughout Set 5. Vayne with Jeweled Gauntlet, LeBlanc with Dark Blue buff, Yasuo 3, Chug Jug, Chug Bug, Soraka reroll, Vlad reroll, and of course, Hellions. There's even more than that, but the point is, Set 5 had a lot of reroll comps. The reason is varied, but it's mostly due to the fact that there was a few low-cost champions just gaining a ton of value from their synergies, once again leading back to the vertical trait issue. Do note the absence of 3-cost champions is the only consistent one throughout Set 5 was Yasuo. This leads us to summing up the meta for Set 5. Lack of consistent 3 and 5-cost carries meant the meta generally favored 4-cost compositions or reroll builds. In both cases, due to the synergies of Set 5 and being able to get more specific items thanks to armories, led to those two types of playstyles being the most common. Before we move on to the next section, let's briefly talk about a few of the unique traits of Set 5. The unique traits we're mostly going to focus on are God King, Cruel, and Draconic. We also want to give a special shout out to Verdant for possibly being the worst synergy ever in TFT, though one of the unique traits on the list is definitely in the running for that title. And that synergy is God King. God King was touted as an important part of Set 5, but at the end of the day, it fell flat. The fact is, the synergy just wasn't interesting. It had the potential to be with the rival system, but the only thing it really did was a minor 20% damage buff against some champions. We've harped on this previously, so we won't go too hard on God King. It's just unfortunate that it had the potential to be a defining aspect of the set, but instead, it's something everyone will likely forget about. A far more interesting trait was Cruel. Cruel may be the most unique trait we've ever seen in TFT, including the ones being introduced in Set 6. Trading health for a unit makes for wildly interesting decision-making, especially when it's late-game champion. That said, costing 6 health did limit how often players got to interact with Teemo and Cruel. Had it been slightly cheaper, Cruel would have been way cooler. And then there's Draconic. Draconic was the Set 5 Fortune-esque trait. The idea behind it, especially thematically, is great. Put the synergy in, gain eggs on your bench, and boom, they hatch into a unit, gold, or component. We won't lie, Draconic was fun at times, but it didn't have a lot of interaction because it was mostly a play and forget type trait. You gain eggs, they hatch after time. Whereas with Fortune, it was up to the player to know when best to lose without losing too much health, while also preparing for a win later to get the payout. Sure, it was volatile and caused a lot of 8s, but it let players interact with the synergy, but with Draconic, it was mostly sit and wait playstyle. That said, Draconic did make for iconic moments in Set 5, and as we said, the theme of the eggs on your bench that hatched was great. To end our look back on the Set 5 meta, let's have a brief overview of each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. Before we get into the stages, let's first talk about the items in the carousel. Shadow items aside, the balance for components and items was consistently top-notch throughout Set 5. There are almost always multiple uses per component, and even Cloak became a viable option with the reworked Dragon's Claw. Having a flexible meta for items helps a lot for players because it reduces the variance of the early game, meaning a good player can consistently do well based on their decisions. Of course, this was tarnished a bit by shadow items, but once the mid-set rolled around, the game was in a great spot for items specifically. Into stage 1 and 2 we go, where, for the most part, the game finally felt fair. Sure, getting gold at the end of 1-4 didn't feel great, and there's still variance in loot orbs, but overall there were fewer extreme cases like a boatload of gold or a 2 gold opener. This once again made for a better competitive environment. Another aspect of Set 5 that was great for the early game, at least in a competitive setting, is how many viable openers the game had. Dawnbringer, Hellion, Skirmisher, Sentinel, Abomination, Nightbringer, and a bunch more early game boards meant the player had a moderate amount of control over how the early game went. Variance, of course, still existed, but a good player was consistently able to make it through Stage 2 with whatever game plan they had. With that, we can move into Stage 3 and the mid-game. Stage 3 was all over the place in Set 5 because some metas heavily favored reroll builds and others leaned into 6-piece vertical traits. Despite there being a lot of diversity in compositions at level 6, there overall wasn't that many decisions to be made, at least until the Radiant Armory was added. Generally, players either began slow rolling for a comp, aimed for an early vertical synergy like Skirmisher, or took a few losses and saved up for Stage 4 and level 7. Stage 4, on the other hand, was a lot more interesting because 4 cost generally dominated the Set 5 meta. Hitting the 4 costs you needed or finding one to build a composition around was the name of the game. Some were stronger than others, such as Mordekaiser in Reckoning or Lucian in the mid-set, but the idea was to find a 4 cost, slap the necessary traits in, and play for level 8. This made level 7 rather easy to play, especially because of vertical traits, but it was certainly a volatile level nonetheless. And that brings us to the late game where players didn't have a lot of choices with their economy. The formula was almost always 2-star your carry, upgrade your board, and focus on positioning. Add 5 costs in when possible, but level 9 was by and large not attainable in most games. Only high roll players really ever got to hit level 9 and play capped boards like Heimerdinger carry. The reason is that level 9 was far too expensive. It's not just reasonable to sit on 50 gold for an entire stage just to level to 9 and have 10 gold to roll. Plus, the power spike of hitting a 5 cost wasn't all that great. Instead, the meta focused on sitting on their level 8 composition, maybe finding a 3-star upgrade, but mainly focusing on positioning. That said, 5 cost champions did play an important part in the late game. Volibear was an essential frontliner because of his large AoE stun and being a counter to shields. In Reckoning, Kindred was hugely impactful with their ability, and Garen or Darius were common frontliners. As we mentioned earlier, Teemo was a powerful late-game champion, just not all that easy to use. But as we've stated, the cost of level 9 just made late game boards limited, so a lot of time 5-cost champions stayed at level 1. The more impactful aspect of the late game in set 5 was positioning. Positioning played a huge role in how well certain champions and compositions did. The best example is, of course, Vel'Koz. The laser squid made for a lot of coin flip scenarios because being on the correct side meant winning with the squid or losing it if you were on the wrong side. But Vel'Koz wasn't the only champion like that. Lucian was similar by targeting the furthest champion, same with Zyra. Abomination was also a factor to consider with the monstrosity. Then there were plenty of impactful abilities to watch out for, like Volibear, Diana, Viego, and Thresh. Basically, in set 5, the best players were often those who knew how to properly and quickly position their board effectively. And that's all for today, folks. Overall, when looking back on set 5, it will likely be seen as an okay set. It had some lows and some highs, but for the most part, it was average. That said, it was one of the better sets in terms of skill expression because it was well balanced, meaning good players were able to be consistent. Unfortunately, that also meant it wasn't that exciting, with a lot of metas being rather uninteresting. Let us know in the comments section below what you enjoyed most from set 5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.